The call came in at 2:16 in the morning. Unit 4, do you copy? We've lost contact with Officer Carver. Minutes later, a patrol car was found on the edge of Owensboro, Kentucky. The engine was still running, headlights cutting through the fog, the driver's door open. Inside, Officer Ethan Carver was slumped over the steering wheel, one bullet to the chest, his weapon untouched. Rain washed away most of the evidence before investigators even arrived. No footprints, no casings, nothing to explain how a trained officer was taken down so cleanly. But one thing stood out, a thin smear of industrial solvent on the door handle, the same kind used in the department's evidence lab. From that moment, the case stopped feeling like an attack from the outside. It felt like something rotten inside the walls of the police department itself. For 27 years, the murder of Officer Ethan Carver stayed unsolved. Files were lost, leads dried up, and silence settled over Owensboro, until one rookie detective decided to open the box everyone wanted to forget. This is the story of a town that trusted the wrong people, the story of loyalty, corruption, and the night justice finally came home. If you're ready to uncover what really happened in Kentucky in 1995, hit subscribe now and stay with me, because what comes next will change everything you thought you knew. Friday, June 9th, 1995. The heat in Owensboro hung low and still, the kind of night where the air tasted of metal and rain that never came. Officer Ethan Carver signed out of the station at 11:45, joked with dispatch about grabbing pie on the way home, and said he would see them in the morning. Carver had worn the badge for 13 years. He was 38, married, father of 2. The kind of man who waved to every neighbor and remembered birthdays he had no reason to remember. People trusted him because he never stopped showing up. In the weeks before he died, something about him changed. His partner noticed it first. Carver was quieter. He stayed late, took unmarked cars, and spent time on the phone outside the station. When asked what was going on, he said only, "Some things don't fit." He never said what he meant. That night, his route was routine, a sweep through the industrial park, then home. But at 1:32 in the morning, his GPS showed a sudden turn toward the old sawmill outside town. No call led him there. No request for backup. Only silence. When his patrol car was found hours later, the engine was running. The headlights were on. Carver was slumped over the steering wheel with a single wound to the chest. His weapon was still holstered. The rain that started just before dawn washed most of the evidence away. Inside the car, investigators found a small notepad open on the passenger seat. The last line read, "Meet him at the mill. Keep quiet." There was no name, no time. At home, his wife Claire told detectives he had received a call around 10 that night. She could not hear the voice on the other end, but she remembered his face. "He looked like someone who already knew the ending," she said. By sunrise, Owensboro was awake and grieving. People gathered outside the police station, lighting candles under the flagpole. The mayor called it an attack on the heart of the town. The chief promised answers. At the funeral, officers lined the street in silence. Claire held the folded flag against her chest while their children stood beside her. In the second row of uniforms stood Leonard Pierce, the department's evidence technician. His face was calm, his hands steady. On his right hand, a faint scar caught the sunlight, the kind that comes from chemical burns. No one asked about it. Not then, and for 27 years no one would. The first officers arrived at the sawmill just after 2 in the morning. Their flashlights cut through the steam rising off the wet ground. The rain had stopped, but the air felt wrong, still, heavy, too quiet for a place that had just seen death. Detective Michael Dorsey led the initial sweep. He was young, sharp, and methodical. When he reached the cruiser, the headlights were still on, painting the gravel in white light. Carver's body was motionless behind the wheel. One shot, straight through the chest. No blood spatter outside the car, no sign of a fight. Whoever pulled the trigger had stood close. The door was unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition. The radio hummed a faint static that broke only when Dorsey leaned inside. He could smell gunpowder mixed with something chemical, something that didn't belong. "Call for forensics," he said quietly. Under the rear tire, they found a partial boot print pressed into wet dirt. It was large, likely male, but too shallow to cast. Nearby, a single shell casing glinted in the light. When the tech bagged it, they noticed it had been wiped clean. Not a trace of fingerprint residue remained. Inside the vehicle, everything was unnaturally tidy. Carver's clipboard was still in place, his sidearm untouched, his notepad open to the same message the wife had mentioned. The only thing out of place was a faint smear on the driver's door handle. The forensic team took a sample. Hours later, the lab confirmed it was a type of solvent used exclusively in the evidence department downtown. The discovery raised questions no one wanted to ask. Why would a chemical from inside the police lab appear at a murder scene miles away? By sunrise, the area was crawling with officers. News trucks lined the road. Reporters fought for sound bites, while the chief ordered everyone to stay quiet. "This department will not eat its own," he said to the detectives. But the words rang hollow. Back at headquarters, Dorsey and his team built a timeline. Carver left the station at 11:45. He stopped briefly at a diner on 5th Street. At 12:15, his patrol car was spotted on Highway 17 heading east. After that, no camera, no witness, no signal. The phone records deepened the mystery. The last incoming call to his phone came from an unregistered number purchased at a convenience store 3 days earlier. 4 minutes long. No trace since. Forensics recovered a single hair from the driver's headrest. It was dark, short, and treated with industrial dye, consistent with department-issued uniforms. When tested, it failed to match Carver or his partner. The report disappeared from the case file 2 weeks later. As the investigation dragged on, rumors began to circulate. Some said Carver had been getting too close to something big. Others claimed he was investigating missing evidence, cash, and drugs that had never reached the logbooks. Detective Dorsey pushed for full transparency, but the chief ordered the file sealed from the press. He called it protection of integrity. Inside the squad room, it felt like something else entirely. By the end of that summer, the case stalled. The solvent sample was misfiled. The shell casing went missing. The anonymous caller who claimed to see a dark sedan near the mill stopped returning calls. It was as if the whole investigation was being erased piece by piece. Within 6 months, the murder of Officer Ethan Carver joined the long shelf of unsolved crimes labeled cold case. But one person in that room already knew the truth, and he was the one who signed the evidence log that night. His name was Leonard Pierce. The task force met for the first time 3 days after the murder. The room smelled of burnt coffee and wet uniforms. Maps covered the walls. Photos of Carver stared back from every angle, as if asking his own department to find what they were missing. Detective Michael Dorsey took the lead. He had no family in Owensboro, no history to protect, and that made him dangerous in a room full of men who did. From the start, he noticed resistance, reports delayed, evidence logged late, people avoiding eye contact when he asked simple questions. They began by retracing Carver's final hours. The diner owner confirmed he'd picked up coffee and 2 slices of pecan pie at 11:52. He seemed calm, paid in cash. Then nothing until the sawmill. Every camera between the diner and Highway 17 had been inactive. Some were broken. Others had missing tapes. The first suspect was a known dealer named Raylan Cutter, recently released on parole. Carver had arrested him the year before. Cutter swore he was home with his girlfriend that night. It sounded weak until the alibi checked out. Time-stamped security footage from a liquor store placed him across town at the exact hour of the murder. The second lead came from a farmer who claimed he'd seen a white pickup speeding away from the mill around 2 in the morning. The description matched half the trucks in the county. When police canvassed the area, no tire tracks could be matched. Rain had washed the road clean. Then there was the anonymous call to dispatch 2 nights later. A man's voice said, "Check your own lockers before hanging up." The call came from a payphone outside a grocery store on Main Street. Fingerprints on the receiver belonged to 3 different officers. None of them admitted using that phone. By week 2, Dorsey had his first internal clash with Leonard Pierce, the evidence technician. Pierce insisted all samples were logged correctly. Dorsey disagreed. The solvent trace from Carver's door handle was missing from the chain of custody forms. Pierce claimed it was a clerical delay. Dorsey ordered an audit. 2 days later, the log was corrected, but the sample itself had vanished. The chief downplayed the issue. "We're dealing with chaos," he told the press. "Nothing sinister." But inside the department, whispers started. Someone was covering tracks. In late June, a potential witness came forward, a truck driver named Tom Latham. He told detectives he'd seen 2 police cruisers parked near the sawmill at 1:30 in the morning. One was Carver's. The other had its lights off. When asked if he could identify the second vehicle's number, he hesitated. "I didn't want to get involved," he said. Days later, Latham recanted his statement and moved out of state. The investigation spiraled. Files disappeared. Leads contradicted one another. The mayor pushed for results. Detectives worked in shifts around the clock, chasing every rumor, every face from Carver's old cases. Then came a break that wasn't a break at all. A partial fingerprint was recovered from the inside of Carver's trunk. It didn't match him or his partner. When it was sent for comparison, the lab reported contamination. The print had been handled after collection. The signature on the evidence form belonged to Leonard Pierce. By the end of the summer, frustration turned to fatigue. Detectives rotated off the task force. Dorsey stayed, but the chief reassigned half his team. Without new leads, the case fell silent. The reward posters stayed up for months, then faded under the sundae. Behind the evidence room door, Pierce kept working quietly, cataloging items from new cases, smiling politely as if nothing had changed. And inside one of those shelves, a sealed box labeled Carver. Ethan vehicle samples, gathered dust. The lock on the cabinet was replaced the following year by Pierce himself. By July, Owensboro was no longer the same town it had been before the shooting. The morning paper ran Carver's name on the front page for 40 days straight. Every photo showed the same smile, the same blue uniform, the same line underneath that read, "Officer Ethan James Carver, end of watch, June 10th, 1995. Flags flew at half-mast. Churches stayed open through the night for anyone who wanted to pray. The high school football field, where Carver had once coached, filled with candles and handwritten notes. Kids wrote letters to Officer Ethan in heaven. But behind all that public grief, something else started to grow. A quiet anger. People whispered in grocery stores that the department was hiding something, that the killer wasn't out there somewhere, but closer. Neighbors who once waved at patrol cars now turned away. Parents told their children not to talk to the police. For the first time in decades, Owensboro felt afraid of its own protectors. At the station, morale cracked. Officers avoided questions from reporters. Some refused to work late shifts. Others asked for transfers. Detective Dorsey noticed the tension every morning, hushed conversations, files that seemed to vanish between hands, and the growing distance between those who wanted the truth and those who didn't. Carver's widow, Claire, came to the station every Friday with a list of questions. Have you found the man who called him that night? Do you know why he went to the mill? The answers were always the same. We're working on it. After a month, she stopped asking. The city council tried to calm the storm. They promised transparency. They hosted community meetings where officials spoke in careful sentences about ongoing efforts and respect for due process. But no one was convinced. When residents stood to speak, they didn't ask about progress. They demanded honesty. One man shouted from the back of the hall, "You're protecting one of your own." The room went silent. No one denied it. For the next year, the case became a wound the town could not close. Every unsolved crime was compared to it. Every police car that passed reminded people of what had been lost. By the anniversary of Carver's death, most residents had stopped expecting answers. They brought flowers to his grave, said his name quietly, and went home before sunset. Inside the department, the culture hardened. Officers trusted fewer people. Files were locked tighter. The evidence room was moved to a restricted section of the building. Leonard Pierce volunteered to oversee the transfer. He worked alone most nights, signing off each item with perfect handwriting. No one questioned why he was so dedicated to a job everyone else avoided. No one asked why he requested new security codes or why the surveillance camera covering the evidence entrance went dark for 2 weeks that summer. Owensboro was grieving, but beneath that grief, rot had already begun. The murder of Ethan Carver had not just taken a man. It had cracked the foundation of a community. And while most people tried to forget, one detective couldn't. Michael Dorsey was convinced the killer was inside the department. He just didn't know how to prove it. Not yet. The evidence room was colder than the rest of the building. Rows of metal shelves, each stacked with sealed boxes, old files, and the weight of unfinished stories. That was where the Carver case had ended up. A brown box, one label, one name. Detective Michael Dorsey stood in front of it late one night, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights. Inside were a few photographs, one empty shell casing, and a chain of custody sheet with a gap that made no sense. The missing item was small, a glass vial containing residue taken from the driver's door handle of Carver's patrol car. It had been logged by Leonard Pierce the morning after the murder. His signature appeared twice. Then nothing. No transfer, no testing, no record of disposal. When Dorsey asked about it, Pierce smiled. "Paperwork backlog," he said. "It'll turn up." His tone was too casual, too steady. Dorsey checked the access log that same evening. Pierce had signed into the evidence room 12 nights in a row, all after midnight. All alone. He had no reason to be there. The next morning, Dorsey went to the chief. "We're missing a chemical sample from the Carver case," he said. "I want a full internal audit." The chief looked tired. "Let it go, Mike. We're under pressure from the mayor. No more noise about this case." Dorsey didn't let it go. He began to photograph the evidence shelves himself, one by one, building a private archive. When he reached the section marked C-95, he noticed something else. One lock had been replaced recently. New metal, new screws, no work order filed. He went to the maintenance log. The signature on the replacement request belonged to Leonard Pierce. A week later, a janitor found a small cardboard tube in the trash behind the evidence room. Inside was broken glass and a trace of hardened residue that smelled faintly of cleaning solvent. The janitor turned it in. Within hours, the item disappeared again. That night, Dorsey sat alone at his desk, staring at the evidence photos. Carver's notepad. The message about the meeting. The polished handle with the chemical trace. The missing vial. It all pointed to one truth he could not yet prove. Someone inside the department had handled the murder scene. Someone had cleaned up after it. By the end of that summer, Dorsey's requests for new testing were denied. His supervisor told him to move on. The Carver file was officially classified as inactive, but Dorsey kept a copy. He stored it in a box under his bed, along with a note that read, "When this breaks open, start here." He did not know it yet, but that small act of defiance would be the reason the truth finally surfaced 27 years later. The Carver file went cold in the summer of 1996. No new evidence, no new leads, just silence. The town moved on, at least on the surface. People still lowered their voices when his name came up, but life in Owensboro returned to its routines. For the department, it was easier to forget. The case was boxed, logged, and pushed to the back of the archive. The reward money stayed unclaimed. The anniversary came and went each June, marked only by a short ceremony and a few flowers at the memorial wall. Detective Dorsey stayed with the force for another 10 years. He kept pushing for answers, even when it made him a problem. Promotions passed him by. Reports disappeared from his desk. In 2003, he left the department and moved to Bowling Green, still carrying his private copies of the case. Claire Carver raised her children quietly. She went back to work at the elementary school and stopped attending public memorials. Her son, Sam, joined the Army. Her daughter, Lily, left for college in Nashville. Every year, on the night of June 10th, Claire lit a single candle in the kitchen window. Inside the Owensboro Police Department, Leonard Pierce continued to rise. He became Chief Evidence Officer in 2001. The same man who had once logged the missing vial now controlled every piece of evidence in the building. He was known for his precision and calm voice. New recruits saw him as a mentor. No one ever questioned how much he knew. By 2010, the Carver case had become a ghost story told to new detectives. They spoke of a good cop who died for reasons no one could explain, a case too clean to solve. The solvent trace, the missing call, the vanished witness, all reduced to rumor. Files aged, technology changed, DNA databases grew, but the Carver evidence was too degraded to test. The lab that had handled the samples closed years earlier. The evidence room moved twice, each time under Pierce's supervision. Then came the flood of 2017. Heavy rain, a burst pipe, and hundreds of boxes soaked. When the department began recovery, one box stood out. It was perfectly dry. The label read, "Carver, Ethan, 1995. Inside, every document was crisp and untouched. Someone had kept it safe. A young clerk named Naomi Lark was helping with the cleanup. She was 24, newly transferred, curious by nature. She asked why that file looked different. No one answered. A week later, she returned at night and read every page. The story didn't add up. Missing evidence, late-night access, no audit trail. It was the first time in 2 decades that someone fresh had seen the cracks. Naomi didn't know it yet, but she had just reopened the case that would define her career. While most of Owensboro had stopped believing justice would come, something in her refused to accept it. She requested permission to digitize the cold case archives for modernization. The request was approved without question. She started scanning the files one by one. Carver's case went last. When she reached the evidence photos, she noticed a reflection on the chrome of the patrol car door. A faint handprint. almost invisible in the light. It was small, narrow fingers, and scarred. Naomi paused. She had seen those same scars on the hand of the quiet man who still ran the evidence room, Leonard Pierce. Detective Naomi Lark had joined the Owensboro Police Department with a reputation for noticing what others missed. She had studied forensic chemistry before switching to law enforcement, a mix that made her both respected and underestimated. When she was assigned to the cold case unit in 2021, she was told not to waste her time on ghosts. But ghosts were exactly what interested her. The Carver file was the first she opened on her own. It wasn't assigned to her. She found it sitting on a separate shelf, cleaner than the rest. When she flipped through the pages, it felt like two different people had handled them. The first half was professional, detailed, alive with effort. The second half was missing signatures, missing photos, missing care. She spent her evenings studying every photograph, every report, and every object that had survived. The solvent trace, the notepad, the door handle, the log signed twice by the same hand. Something about it stayed with her. One morning, she ran into Leonard Pierce near the evidence vault. He was older now, gray at the temples, polite, and perfectly calm. "I heard you're digging up old bones," he said. She smiled back. "Sometimes old bones still talk." He chuckled, but his eyes didn't. "Be careful where you dig," he said, walking away. That night, Naomi couldn't sleep. She went back to the station after hours and unlocked the cold case storage with her new clearance card. She checked the access records for the Carver evidence over the last 20 years. Pierce's name appeared again and again. Dozens of late-night entries, no supervising signatures. She started a hidden log of her own, dates, times, anomalies. When she cross-referenced the entries, she noticed a pattern. Every time a new chief was appointed, Pierce accessed the Carver file within a week. It was as if he was making sure nothing had changed. Naomi decided to retest what little evidence remained. The vial was gone, but a fragment of dried residue had stuck to the inner flap of one evidence bag. She sent it quietly to a private lab in Louisville under a coded reference. 2 weeks later, the results came back. The sample contained traces of a decontamination compound used only in police evidence facilities during the mid-90s. Its specific chemical composition matched a batch produced for the Owensboro Department. In other words, the killer had used a cleaner only available inside that building. Naomi brought the report to her supervisor, Lieutenant Harris. He scanned the page, frowned, and said, "This isn't official. You had no authorization." She nodded. "I know, but it's proof someone inside touched that car." Harris sighed. "Naomi, that case is a graveyard. The man who ran evidence back then is retired. Let it go." But she didn't. She went home and called Michael Dorsey, the retired detective who had once led the original investigation. He lived alone outside Bowling Green. When she told him who she was, there was a long silence on the line. Then he said, "If you're reopening that case, you'd better be ready for what comes out." They met the next day at a diner halfway between their towns. Dorsey looked older than she expected, but his eyes were still sharp. He handed her a small metal key and said, "Storage locker 42, Riverfront Depot. Everything they buried is in there." Inside that locker, Naomi found his old notes, Polaroids, and the photocopy of a maintenance order from 1996. The signature at the bottom was clear. Leonard Pierce. Naomi stared at it for a long time. For the first time in 27 years, the Carver case was breathing again. The lab report arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Naomi Lark had it printed and sealed inside a plain envelope. She waited until the building emptied before opening it in her office. The paper smelled faintly of toner and dust, but the words were sharp enough to slice through 27 years of silence. Compound match confirmed. Source restricted to Owensboro Police Department 1995, 1998 batch. Probability of external contamination less than 1%. Her heart sank and lifted at the same time. The residue on Carver's patrol car could only have come from one place, the department's own evidence lab. She spent that night tracing the distribution record for the compound. Only 5 officers had clearance to handle it in 1995. One of them was Leonard Pierce. Naomi cross-checked every name against employment records, transfers, and resignations. 2 had retired. 1 had moved to another state. 1 had died, only Pierce was still there. Still walking those same halls, still holding the master key. The next morning, Naomi walked into the evidence room, pretending to file paperwork. Pierce stood near the back shelf, cataloging narcotics samples with the same quiet focus he was known for. He looked up when she entered. "Morning, Detective," he said. She smiled faintly. "I found something interesting. A cleaning compound from the old days. Still turns up in the oddest places." His expression didn't change, but his hands paused for a second too long before he continued stacking boxes. "Old chemicals tend to linger," he said. "Sometimes it's just contamination." "Maybe," she answered. "But contamination doesn't sign its name in ink." That night, Naomi called Dorsey. She read him the lab results word for word. He didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then he said, "He never stopped watching that file. I think he kept something. Find his personal logs. He always wrote everything down." The next step was risky. Naomi filed an internal requisition for Pierce's old access records, citing an audit of digital archives. The request went through automatically. Within hours, she had 30 years of sign-in data, hundreds of entries, every one time-stamped. She noticed something immediately. Each June 10th, the anniversary of Carver's death, Pierce accessed the evidence room between midnight and 2 in the morning. For nearly 3 decades, he had visited that box on the same night every year. It was ritual. Naomi pulled up surveillance footage from the last anniversary. The cameras didn't show much low resolution, poor angle, but one frame caught her breath. Pierce standing at shelf C95, the Carver box open, his gloved hand resting on a plastic bag. He wasn't cataloging. He was staring. The next week, Naomi convinced her lieutenant to authorize forensic reanalysis of the case materials under the pretext of digitization for training. The evidence was transferred to a secure lab. When technicians examined the bag Pierce had been touching, they found something no one had noticed before: a faint fingerprint impression on the inner flap, preserved by static cling. The pattern was partial but distinctive. They ran it through the state database. It matched Leonard Pierce. Naomi sat alone in her car after receiving the result, engine idling, phone in her hand. The weight of it settled on her chest. The man everyone trusted, the man who had guarded the evidence for half his life, had left his own print on the murder scene's storage bag. She called Dorsey again. "I have him," she said quietly. Dorsey exhaled slowly. "Then it's time to finish what we started." The arrest took place on a gray morning in April of 2022. The air smelled of rain and rust from the nearby rail yard. Detective Naomi Lark had been awake for 30 hours straight, waiting for the moment the warrant would clear. When it finally did, she folded it carefully and said one word to the team standing beside her. "Go." Leonard Pierce lived alone on the east side of Owensboro. A small brick house with a trimmed lawn and white curtains that never opened. When the unmarked cars pulled into his street, he was already standing on the porch, wearing a pressed shirt and holding a cup of coffee. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He set the cup down on the railing, turned, and placed his hands behind his back before anyone told him to. The cuffs clicked shut in complete silence. Inside his home, investigators found what they didn't expect. Every drawer labeled, every paper sorted, shelves filled with binders marked by case numbers that should have been locked inside the department. Near the back of the house, they discovered a small room sealed from the inside with soundproof panels. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings. Every story about Officer Ethan Carver. Funeral photos, anniversary vigils, old headlines printed and taped in perfect alignment. On one shelf sat a single cardboard box labeled Carver Original Evidence. Inside was the missing vial, still half full, sealed with the same red tape used in the evidence room 27 years earlier. Forensics confirmed the residue inside matched the sample taken from Carver's patrol car. The handwriting on the label was Pierce's. When Naomi confronted him in the interrogation room, he looked older than ever. The fluorescent light caught the small burn mark on his right hand, the scar that had once gone unnoticed. "Why did you keep it?" she asked. He smiled faintly. Someone had to make sure it stayed safe. Safe from what? Pierce leaned forward. From people who don't understand loyalty. Carver didn't. He wanted to expose things that would have destroyed good men. So I cleaned up his mess. Naomi stared at him. "You killed him." He didn't answer. But his silence was enough. Over the next week, investigators uncovered a trail that stretched back decades. Pierce had been the quiet gatekeeper of the department's darkest corners. Missing drugs, altered reports, untraceable cash. He had manipulated evidence to protect a small circle of officers who were taking money from organized distributors in western Kentucky. When Carver discovered the discrepancies in the narcotics log, he confronted the wrong person. Pierce arranged a meeting under the pretense of sharing information. They met at the sawmill after midnight. He shot Carver once through the chest, wiped down the scene with solvent from the lab, and removed anything that could trace back to him. Then he became the man in charge of the evidence, ensuring nothing ever surfaced. For 27 years he had stood at every memorial, shaken hands with Carver's family, and filed every audit that cleared him. The control gave him a kind of satisfaction no one around him ever noticed. At the press conference, the police chief struggled for words. Leonard Pierce betrayed this department in a way that defies understanding. The man who protected our evidence was the one who destroyed it. When they led Pierce out of the station, reporters shouted his name. He didn't look at them. He glanced once at Naomi and said quietly, "You found what you were told not to look for." Naomi didn't respond. She watched as the car door closed and the engine carried him away. The sound of it echoed through the courtyard until it faded completely. For the first time in 27 years, Owensboro was silent for the right reason. The trial of Leonard Pierce began in February of 2023. The courthouse was packed long before the first session started. Reporters from across Kentucky filled the benches, notebooks ready. In the front row sat Claire Carver, now gray-haired but steady, her hands clasped around a photograph of Ethan in uniform. The prosecution presented the story with painful precision. The missing vial, the chemical match, the fingerprint on the evidence bag, the access logs showing Pierce entering the vault every year on June 10th. The files recovered from his home that linked him to narcotics evidence tampering. Each piece alone was suspicious. Together they formed a map of guilt, When Naomi Lark took the stand, the room was silent. She spoke clearly, describing the moment she discovered the chemical trace and the months of quiet work that led to his arrest. The defense tried to discredit her by calling the lab work unofficial, but the jury listened to her with the same focus she had once given the case. Then came Michael Dorsey, the retired detective who had carried the truth longer than anyone. He told the court how he had filed reports that vanished, how his audit requests had been denied, and how Pierce had always been there, calm and helpful, each time a file went missing. When the prosecution rested, they played one final clip from the interrogation. Naomi's voice asking, "Why did you keep it?" And Pierce answering, "Because someone had to." The jury watched him on screen, expression blank, hands folded, as if confessing without saying the words. The defense called no witnesses. Deliberation lasted less than 5 hours. The verdict was read just after midnight. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. No one spoke. The sound of Claire's breath caught in her throat was the only thing that moved in the room. Pierce sat still. No surprise, no anger, no regret. Only a faint nod, as if he had expected this ending from the start. When the judge asked if he wanted to address the court, he said, "The truth is heavier than people think." Then he looked at Naomi. "You'll learn that someday." The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Outside, the courthouse steps filled with cameras and lights. The town that had lived with a question for 27 years finally had an answer. People stood in the cold holding candles. Some cried. Others just watched the courthouse windows, as if expecting to see Ethan Carver's shadow walk past one last time. Inside, Naomi sat alone in the empty hallway. Dorsey walked over, handed her a small envelope, and said, "This is yours now." Inside was Carver's old notepad, the same one found in his patrol car. On the first page he had written one line that no one had noticed before. "Truth always finds the ones who look long enough." Naomi closed the notebook and slipped it into her coat pocket. Outside, the sun was rising. After 27 years, the night had finally ended. The trial ended, but the shadow of it stayed. Owensboro tried to return to normal life, yet nothing felt the same. For years the town had carried a secret it didn't know it held, and now that it was gone, the silence felt heavier than before. The police department changed first. The chief ordered a full reform of evidence handling. Every file, every photograph, every fingerprint was moved to a new digital vault with double verification. Officers were rotated out of long-held positions to prevent control from settling in one place. For the first time, audits were done by external investigators. A plaque was installed near the main entrance of the building. It showed a photo of Ethan Carver in uniform and a single line beneath it. He protected what others tried to hide. Every officer who entered the building saw it. Some looked away. Others saluted. Detective Naomi Lark was promoted 6 months after the verdict. She refused to take a public statement or appear in front of the cameras. When reporters asked what it felt like to solve a 27-year-old case, she said, "It wasn't about solving it. It was about finishing it." She kept in touch with Claire Carver, visiting her once a month. They sat on the porch, watching the streetlights flicker on. Claire always brought 2 cups of coffee, one for her and one for Ethan, the way she had for years. "I never stopped believing," she said one evening. Naomi smiled. Neither did he. Michael Dorsey passed away quietly that winter. At his funeral, Naomi placed the original notepad beside his coffin. "You were right," she whispered. "The truth does find the ones who look long enough." As for Leonard Pierce, he was moved to the state penitentiary in Eddyville. He spent his days in the prison library, cataloging books, writing letters no one received. When a journalist asked if he regretted anything, he said, "Regret is for people who think they made mistakes. I made choices." In the years that followed, Owensboro learned to trust again, though never completely. Parents still told their children the story of the officer who cared too much and the man who used loyalty as a weapon. The old sawmill was torn down, replaced by a small park with a single oak tree planted in the center. At its base, a plaque read, "For Ethan Carver, truth endures." Each June 10th, people gather there. They light candles, tell the story again, and remind each other what silence can cost. Naomi goes too. She stands a few steps away, listening to the sound of crickets in the tall grass. Sometimes she imagines she hears a radio crackle in the distance, a voice calling in through static. "Unit 4. Do you copy?" She always answers quietly. "We do." Then she walks back toward town, leaving the candles to burn until morning. Because in Owensboro, Kentucky, the night finally belongs to the living again. For 27 years, the name Ethan Carver was a question without an answer. A town lived in the shadow of a lie, and the man guarding the truth stood behind the same badge meant to protect it. This case reminds us that justice does not die with time. It waits, sometimes for decades. Sometimes for one person brave enough to open a forgotten file and look again. If this story moved you, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week, we bring you real cases where truth hides in plain sight, waiting to be seen. And tell me in the comments, do you believe every secret eventually comes out, or are some buried forever? Because somewhere out there, another file is gathering dust, and someone is about to open it.